Please be seated. As you may know, the Dean doesn't normally introduce members of our own community who are coming to give Friday night lectures. And tonight, we are very happy to have one of our own up here tonight. But I wanted to take this chance to give a very warm welcome to all of our alumni. It's been a joy to meet some of you for the first time and others of you after some years of separation. So enjoy the weekend, and I'm going to now turn it over to the person who needs no introduction, Ms. Zena Hitz.
Ms. Pellman did not mention that I am also being welcomed back because I am a member of the class of '94 that's celebrating its reunion this year. And in light of that, I wanted to dedicate this lecture to two of our classmates who we lost in the past few years, both very suddenly and both well before their time. I just want to tell you a little bit about them. Why is someone laughing? Anyway, Michael Miller was a quiet student. Like many such students, his habit of silence masked serious and extensive reading, imagining, and thinking. He read large volumes of literature into the years after graduation. He wrote fiction and reflections, and he shared with a lucky few his thoughts in conversation. He worked as a switchboard operator at a hospital for which he had been trained at the college switchboard, which we used to have. And he was a devoted and loving husband and father. Eddie Ames was what we call a transfer student. He studied aerospace engineering for 3 years before becoming bored and disaffected. After traveling around the country, he enrolled as a January freshman at the age of 26. As a St. John's student, he used his excellent STEM education to help his fellow students through their Newton and Maxwell. After St. John's, he enlisted in the Army, served in civil affairs units overseas, and then became a math teacher, punctuated only by a time nursing his mother through some years of dementia. He had a passion for Shakespeare and Mozart, whose work fed him and consoled him until the very end of his life. So for these two men, and for so many others, the college is not just one launching pad among others, but indispensable to the development of a rich and nourishing inner life and a foundation for loving service to others. So I consider it the privilege of my life to be a part of the education of human beings like them. Okay, now the lecture is going to begin. Hard Times, a novel by Charles Dickens, begins with a short speech given by Thomas Gradgrind, a father and, as his name suggests, the headmaster of a school. Gradgrind, okay, sorry. Now, what I want is facts. Teach these boys and girls nothing but facts. Facts alone are wanted in life. Plant nothing else and root out everything else. You can only form the minds of reasoning animals upon facts. Nothing else will ever be of service to them. This is the principle on which I bring up my own children, and this is the principle on which I bring up these children. Stick to facts, sir. What Gradgrind means by facts is briefly illustrated in the following classroom scene when a student addressed as girl number 20 cannot properly define a horse. The schoolmaster turns to another student. "Bitzer," said Thomas Gradgrind, "your definition of a horse." "Quadruped, graminivorous, 40 teeth, namely 24 grinders, 4 eye teeth, and 12 incisive. Sheds coat in spring, in marshy countries, sheds hoofs too, hoofs hard, but requiring to be shod with iron, age known by marks in mouth. Thus, and much more, Bitzer, "Now, girl number 20, said Mr. Gradgrind, "you know what a horse is." The realm of facts from which this answer is drawn seems to offer accounts of matters of common experience that are concrete, digestible, objective, and correct. Numbers are used when possible. The facts range from the obvious, horses have 4 legs, to the hypothetically practical, numbers of teeth, how to care for hooves, how to judge age. Hypothetical practicality or usefulness seems to me an earmark of a fact. So I have this general, somewhat inchoate suspicion that the realm of facts is the realm of the useful. So much is suggested in Dickens' novel. Mr. Gradgrind's closest associate is Mr. Bounderby, owner of the local mill, the wealthiest man for miles, identified as a self-made entrepreneur. With Mr. Bounderby's help, Mr. Gradgrind eventually enters Parliament. The realm of facts, it is suggested, is closely intertwined with the realm of utility, and utility with wealth and power. Mr. Bounderby squeezes as much out of his mill workers as he can. In that way, admittedly loose and hard to nail down the details, the realm of facts is not only a resource for various practical concerns, but a system of rule, or even a kind of tyranny. Now, I'm going to leave the novel behind because my point is not so much to think about this particular constellation of characters that Dickens presents, but to try to understand better and to articulate certain practices and principles of the college. So as newcomers to us will have begun to understand, even by now, a fact is typically an unwelcome offering in our conversations. This can be a surprise to many, a struggle to many, and a scandal to some. Most notoriously, we neglect historical facts, or context, as it is often called. In support of our ancient practice, I'd like to try to undermine the realm of facts as a source of explanation or understanding, as much as possible on terms that lovers of facts might understand. Friends of the facts. Someone used that term at dinner. I liked that a lot. So I would like to reach the friends of the facts, as well as people who are already hostile. I'm going to begin with facts in general, but in the second part of my lecture, I will make an attempt to fulfill the promise of my title and turn from facts as such to specific difficulties that the study of history presents for liberal education. But for now, the facts. A statement of fact always represents a human judgment. The fact about the weather is the judgment of a meteorologist or the observant and experienced layperson. The fact about the year in which William the Conqueror invaded England is the judgment of a historian. The fact about what a Greek word means, or what counts as a rule of Greek grammar, these are the chief facts facing our freshmen, that's a judgment made by a philologist or a grammarian. The fact about how to get from Annapolis to Cape Henlopen, the land of dolphins, is the judgment of an experienced driver. These days, such judgments may be processed and mediated by machines. Those machines are not just imitations of human judgment. They rely on human judgment. That is, they require real human judgments as inputs. Without human judgments as a basis, machines would produce useless gibberish. Some judgments have a kind of immediacy and concreteness that bears truth with them. I open the drawer at my lab station in one of the lab classrooms. There are a pair of tongs. There are tongs in the drawer, I proclaim. I know it's true because it's right before my eyes. If others are around and doubt me, I gesture towards the tongs, bidding all to gather near and share my immediate, overwhelming experience of the presence of tongs in the drawer. If others are not around, I may find myself alone with my fact, a fact that others may doubt or ignore or even scoff at. Oh, they say, tongs in the drawer. Sure. Are there also little goblins? So I'm being very silly, but my intention is serious. The judgments arising from immediate experience are perhaps the most vivid we have. And yet that vividness, the sort of radiance of the truth of the judgment, is not always shareable with others. If I am reporting on the contents of the lab drawers in the freshman lab rooms to anyone without access to those rooms, and there are hundreds, thousands, billions of people without access to our lab rooms, they must rely on some authority implicit in my report. Most things we call facts are not the objects of our immediate experience. Their truth is usually unavailable. I'm thinking about how the way the word is used customarily. It's a little loose, but this is how I'm thinking about it. The truth of a fact is usually unavailable, and that's when we most especially use the word fact to communicate a claim to knowledge that is not shared by our audience. When we state facts, we hide the original judgment, whether ours or someone else's, under an air of authority. A statement of fact, generally speaking, is a demand for agreement on a question when the ground or basis or evidence for the judgment is not necessarily available. Often the reliance of factual judgments on authority does not matter very much. That's because such judgments are eminently practical. Consider the judgments arising from immediate experience that guide us through our day-to-day lives, often beneath our notice. What we judge to be in the kitchen cupboard guides what we buy at the supermarket. How many people are in the fishbowl at 10:30 guides where we will sit in between classes. The reading listed on the seminar list guides what we read for seminar. My judgment that I need a cigarette guides my decision to smoke one. Go get tongs from the drawer in the the lab room, may or may not mark a successful endeavor, depending on whether the underlying judgment was correct or not. Likewise, my friend in the passenger seat, giving me directions to Cape Henlopen, will be immediately tested as to the reliability of their judgment. If they are wrong, we will be lost or stranded. If they are right, all will go well. That means that my earlier suggestion that facts are unwelcome in our classrooms is not quite true. It's permitted, indeed necessary, for us to offer judgments about what is likely to be true as a matter of fact when the consequences will surface in short order. There's colored chalk across the hall. I think if we cut the fish this way, we won't damage its heart. The passage we're talking about is in the 3rd chapter. I think that noun is in the genitive, or that interval is a major third, or that planarium has been cut too many times, it's dead. Yet in daily conversation and in everyday writing outside the college, facts are not used only in this simple practical way, but as a claim to authority on broader questions of human life, moral, political, or questions about the ways of nature. If such facts are justified, it's by further facts, studies, science, historians. Facts are the judgments of experts, again, presented where those experts or their expertise are typically absent. Suppose we were to answer the opening question in our seminar with facts. This might be a kind of place where the lecture degenerates into mere entertainment. I'm not sure, but anyway. You be the judge. The tutor asks, "Why is Achilles so angry?" The student answers, "The progressive threat response in mammals is mediated by a system that runs from the medial amygdaloidal areas downward, largely through the stria terminalis to the medial hypothalamus, and from down there for the dorsal half of the periaqueductal gray." Okay. Or the tutor asks, "Why are there two creation stories at the opening of Genesis?" Student describes a study saying that neurological networks underpinning God representations amplify human empathetic responses. Is Don Quixote crazy? Well, increases in the chemical dopamine can cause hallucinations, delusions, and disorganized thinking. By the way, of course, I did not draw on any knowledge of neuroscience to write these responses. You can guess where I got them. Google. I could, of course, give similar answers, not from neuroscience, but from history, or something that looks like history. Why is Achilles angry? Well, the Greeks had a shame culture. Why are there two Genesis stories? Philological evidence shows that there are two different authors. Is Don Quixote crazy? My errantry was widely admired in early modern Spain. Here, just to disclose my sources, the first claim is bullshit. The second is true, and I fabricated the third one from scratch. Okay. So what has gone wrong when we try to answer questions of that kind in this way? First of all, as I've suggested, an appeal to a fact is appeal to an authority. Secondly, and more surprisingly, and maybe most, this might be a case where I'm pushing hard on an extreme view, a statement of fact, because it is an appeal to authority, does not convey learning at all. That a statement of fact is a claim to authority can be illustrated by two contrasts. Consider, first of all, matters of common experience. Oak trees come from acorns. The sun rises each morning in the east. Matters of common experience are generally available, extremely useful in thinking about things, especially with others. And they may not be always strictly true. How many acorns are gobbled by squirrels and never become trees? What assures the relationship between the sun and the sky in the long term? Yet they are true enough, and, or as Aristotle puts it, true always or for the most part. Yet I doubt we would call these matters of common experience fact. Consider next the enunciations to the propositions of Euclid. For example, that circles are to one another as the squares on their diameters. We spend as much time as it takes in class demonstrating the proofs that Euclid offers for these claims, sometimes offering alternative proofs, sometimes questioning the terms or the methods of the proofs. We might describe this activity as a pursuit of truth so far as the objects in question are concerned. Yet I think in these circumstances, we would not describe those enunciations, however luminously true and well justified, as facts. So if that's right, a fact is not just something true about the world. There are truths that we do not tend to call facts. Sometimes we examine these truths, as we do with the propositions of Euclid. Sometimes we take them for granted, provisionally, as we do with matters of common experience. But by contrast, as I've suggested, to call something a fact is a claim to knowledge, a claim to authority. It doesn't have that transparency. When we accept that authority and trust in the fact, we give the speaker a certain status, the status of a knower. Now, a knower in the ideal case may be able to offer an explanation or justification of the preferred fact. It may be possible in certain special circumstances for that to be shared in the manner that learning can be shared. But In the practices of which I know, the fact exchange, the explanation is often also in factual terms, or an appeal to further generic authorities, studies, or scientists. And that makes the factual claim a kind of oracle, a voice from a rock that speaks, somehow, a truth whose source we cannot evaluate or understand. So much supports our common experience at the college. Why are we irritated when a fact is introduced in class? Because the statement of fact pretends to an authority that stands outside the community of the classroom, so smothers the flame of serious conversation, or threatens to. But more than that, the questions which open our conversations are not answerable by fact. They are not, as is common in other forms of schooling, questions set to test our mastery of some material, pre-digested material, that is, laid out on a grid for the purposes of competitive box checking. We ask real, open-ended questions, motivated by a desire to understand. The conversation may undermine the basis of the question, build a way to answer it, go around in circles for a time, but it is never artificially digested by one person for others, or not generally. With experience, I think it becomes obvious to most of us, if not all, who come to the college, that the forms of conversation opened up by the exclusion of facts are exciting, fascinating, edifying, and wholesome. Forced to resources we can share, we read more carefully. We are forced to seek words and phrases whose meaning is transparent as matters of common experience, however irritating it may be at first to say downward tendency instead of gravity. But gravity is a term mediated by experts. So we are forced to speak more carefully and more thoughtfully, and our subject matter, whatever it is we're talking about, lays itself out and makes itself more transparent. Now, if we think again about our Euclid propositions, it becomes clear that what is presented in our classes as an invitation to examination, inquiry, or study can be presented as a fact in another context. Shortly, the freshmen will turn to Euclid's famous proof about the relation of the sides of right triangles. It's likely to be familiar to them already as a fact. It has a pretentious title, the Pythagorean theorem, as if that told us anything about it. And it has a snappy-sounding modernized formula, a squared plus b squared equals c squared. What is the relationship between the factual claim used as a weapon by know-it-alls in schools around the world and the piece of Euclid's writing that we discuss in class? Here's a simple answer, or it's not really simple, but it sounds simple. The know-it-all's fact is dead. Euclid's proposition, when a single person works through it or several of us together, is alive. It is more alive, I think, even than my vivid experience of the tongs in the lab drawer. Like all living things, it takes time to come to understand it, and new aspects of it emerge over the course even of years. I had a student in freshman math once who presented an alternate proof by baking cakes in the shape of right triangles and the squares on their sides. She then cut up the cake squares and laid them on top of each other to show their equality. Is that a good alternate proof or not? Why not? I'll leave that question to you. By contrast, a fact, when it is not simply a tool for establishing authority or jockeying for status, may point to something true and even deeply true. But it has been desiccated, dried up, like astronauts' ice cream. I don't know whether that's a really out-of-date reference. But when I was young, there was this fashionable kind of novelty gift that was like food astronauts ate. Came in little foil packages. There were strawberries, and there was ice cream, and it tasted just awful. Everything tasted a little bit like foam rubber, basically. So the truth of the fact has been desiccated or dried up like astronauts' ice cream, and it has traveled far away from its source in a person's thinking and judgment. It might even be a mere disconnected symbol whose meaning has been lost. In Plato's Phaedrus, which we read by long tradition at the end of both freshman year and senior year, Socrates tells a story of the invention of writing in Egypt. So back on the handout, if you're following the handout. I won't use the numbers. I didn't get a chance to put my own numbers in here, so anyway, you'll figure it out. It's not that hard. So Socrates tells a story of the invention of writing in Egypt. Its inventor, the god Thoth, claims that it will help people to remember writing well, but the god serving as king, Thamus, objects. This invention will produce forgetfulness in the minds of those who learn by the neglect of their memory. Their trust in writing, produced by external characters, which are no part of themselves, will discourage the use of their own memory within them. You have found a medicine not for memory, but for reminding. You furnish your students with the appearance of wisdom, not true wisdom, for they have heard many things without teaching, and will therefore seem to know a lot, despite being ignorant for the most part, and difficult to live with. It's a nice touch, right? Since they are not wise, but only appear wise. Facts like writing are knowledge and storage. Desiccated understanding, stored up to be rehydrated or restored to life at a later time or place. They are stand-ins or representations of a living understanding, such as the active judgment of the living human being that originates it. Once put outside a person in ink on paper or in encoded pixels, the origin falls from view. As Socrates goes on to say, the disembodied record of the judgment is rolled around everywhere, like flotsam and jetsam on the sea, able to be claimed by anyone, whether they have the understanding it represents or not. Is there any better description of the condition that we live in? We swim in sentences without knowing who spoke them or why. Free-floating claims can lodge in our minds like spores and grow. We can repeat them as if we know and understand their origins in real human thinking and judgment, but nothing will stop up our mouths and prevent us if we do not. Their automatic authority motivates us to cling to them when the going gets tough, or when we fear diminishment or loss of status. Worse than that, our technological habits suggest that we believe that learning consists in the minimal acquisition of these dried up and dead judgments. And I mean minimal, if you think about how a GPS works, you don't even have to learn the judgment. You just obey the order, it passes through you from the GPS to the driver. It's easy to forget that not only all true judgments, but all interesting judgments originate in a living activity, getting to know a subject matter, reading, studying, observation, thinking, imagining, and examining possibilities. If we do not cultivate these activities in ourselves or in others, we risk becoming circulators of dead sound and symbol, exposed to an endless and unresolvable struggle for power and status. Of course, it's not quite right to call facts dead. What's dead remains so. In our study of Euclid, or in the whole mathematics program, we enter into the living origins of dead facts. So the mathematical flotsam and jetsam in which we swim in as a matter of course, becomes examined and brought to life. We could say that we revivified dead learning. That sounds a little creepy, as if we were making zombies or something like that. We could use the phrase Jacob Klein used in this context, the great founding dean of St. John's, following Edmund Husserl, that what we do at the college is desedimentation, scraping off the deadening shell of the fact exchange of the written and received word, and seeing the truth of things as vividly as if it were before our eyes. I've suggested that the most visible effect of the use of facts in our classrooms, and the most obvious complaint to make about it, is the threat that the use of authority makes to our spirit of collaboration and openness. Our careful listening to the voices of books and to one another's voices is interrupted by a demand for assent. Yet this argument against facts in the classroom, however common, is too weak. I want to suggest that the appeal to facts at best distracts and most commonly disrupts the use of our active powers to learn and to understand. To see this more clearly, I turn at last to history proper. I should have said my lecture has two parts. This is the beginning of the second part. But I also kind of wanted to say that it has as many parts as in a line, which is also true. But it does come to an end. Okay. Somehow. I suggest that we make a rough and ready distinction between scientific facts on the one hand and historical facts on the other. For those of you who don't know many academics, we use the term rough and ready distinction when we mean crass, incomplete, and probably wrong. The realm of scientific facts, to speak simply, seeks to explain everything that happens, at least everything material, in terms of what things are made of, the most immediate causes of motion and change, and in terms of the laws of nature, laws which are often or usually mathematically conceived. One of the very great privileges of studying at St. John's is the privilege of thinking through, over a period of years in great depth, the claims of this scientific realm. And it's in every year of study. It's a wonderful, beautiful thing that none of us knew that we wanted to do before we came, but we discovered that we did. Anyway, each of you will have ample opportunity, or has already if you're coming back as alums, to think through the explanatory claims of science and the status of scientific fact. Now, what about historical fact? The nature of history and historical study gets much less attention in our curriculum. Those graduate institute students who choose the history sequence option will work through a daunting set of reflections on history and its nature, daunting and profound and wonderful. Otherwise, we have an essay by Nietzsche, read in the second semester of senior seminar, The Use and Abuse of History for Life. And it's this essay that guides the remainder of this lecture. So 2 warnings. I'm not going to read all the passages on the handout. The essay is so delightful I couldn't resist including them, and I had to hold myself back from including more. Secondly, I'm focusing on points with which I am sympathetic to Nietzsche, where he's taught me something or where his formulation seems to me vivid and true. Yet in the end, I have disagreements that would separate the view that I'm trying to explain from his. And given the short span of the lecture and the short span of this piece of the lecture, it's going to be a bit of a muddle in that respect. And if anyone wants to take it up in the question period, we can. Nietzsche mocks his contemporaries, the historically learned Germans of the 19th century, as walking encyclopedias, as dragging around with them a huge quantity of indigestible stones of knowledge, which then, as in the fairy tale, can sometimes be heard rumbling around inside of them. The craze for ingesting information, facts, the craze for a historical or scholarly approach to everything has, in Nietzsche's view, dehumanized them. For him, the indifferent collection of an endless stream of historical facts is the sign of a kind of disorder a misuse of learning. What's the nature of this disorder? He describes Mozart and Beethoven as engulfed by all the learned dust of biography and compelled by the torture instruments of historical criticism to answer 1,000 impertinent questions. Now, Mozart and Beethoven are, as we know, are composers of music, voluminous amounts of music. But there's also, I gather, a massive amount of literature on their biography and on various details of their lives and the history in which they lived. There's something strange about this. The music is why these people matter, as opposed to other Central European males alive in the late 18th or early 19th century. I find it hard to believe that anything in someone's biography could explain what matters about the music. That would not be better gotten by listening carefully, repeatedly, with understanding to the music itself. Consider another example, one that Nietzsche does not mention, but which I'm sure he was familiar, because this practice, which continues to the present day, began in the 19th century Germany. Scholars of Plato sought to discover the order in which Plato had written the dialogues, and so to give an account of the development of his thought. This was thought to be a scientific, or is still thought to be, a scientific account of philosophy. So one might be told some dialogues are early, others middle, some late. Masses of pages of ink have been spilt arguing about the details of the order. And the distinction would reflect changes in view on a more or less biographical basis. At one point, Plato idolizes Socrates, then he develops things that he thinks belong to Socrates, then in his old age he rejects Socrates. That's the narrative. There's no evidence for it, just by the way. Adherents of this theory do not enter into conversations with Socrates or with the other interlocutors, or so into the practice of philosophy. They cherry-pick theses that appear in the text and invent stories about how each develops from the other. Just as the Mozart or Beethoven biographers diminish unearthly music to the banalities of ordinary life, so do these scholars diminish the great inspiration to philosophical conversation and the philosophical life presented in the dialogues. Now, so far, I think, in my account of Nietzsche, we've only suggested that a historical approach to books or to music might be pointless or distracting. But for Nietzsche, the historical approach is worse than a distraction. It's harmful, it's destructive. He speaks, this is a continuation of the passage about Mozart and Beethoven, whatever his number is. Does the engulfing in literature and the torture of the composers with impertinent questions not mean it's premature death, or at least paralysis, when that, the living effects of which are not yet exhausted, is subjected to the curious investigation of the countless minutiae of its life and works, and when problems of knowledge are sought, when one ought to live and forget all problems? What does he mean by living and forgetting all problems? It works a bit better for music than for Plato's philosophy. It's hard to see entering into the dialogues as forgetting problems. Still, we are meant to listen to music, perform it, compose it, but not to study it. Likewise, Plato invites us to practice philosophy, to face philosophical problems, not to examine whether a moment's indigestion might have made him forget to apply something called the theory of forms. Nietzsche claims that 19th century Germans, walking encyclopedias, cannot live. And I take that to mean they collect words without ingesting them or taking them to heart. They are not inspired to live out philosophy, to write music or poetry, to experience music or poetry, but to summarize everything in a book and to hold it at arm's length. By contrast, we can ingest Mozart as Beethoven did. After all, Beethoven was some kind of a student of Mozart. Or ingest Plato as Aristotle did, likewise, Aristotle being Plato's student, as a soil for further growth, as something in the light of which one might act or think or create. Nietzsche's insight here is that the historical approach to certain figures or topics can be a kind of deliberate deadening. That is not just something that happens by accident, but something which is done with some kind of, by a choice, however malinformed a choice. If facts are dead thinking, by burying art or thinking or the life of action into facts, we make a kind of war on what matters. So that's a piece of the sort of the negative case about what a big picture of the wrongs of a historical culture, of viewing history as being the primary science of understanding the human things. For Nietzsche, smothering real thinking and creativity is not the only thing history does. He thinks that history properly practiced is essential for life. What does he mean by proper practice? And why does he think it's essential? He distinguishes three types of history he considers salutary or healthy or helpful. One is monumental, one is antiquarian, and the other is critical. I think this is it's described in one of the passages in your handout. Monumental history looks to the past for inspiration. Antiquarian history looks to steward the history of a place or a community as a way to care for that place or community. Critical history seeks to uncover a wrong of the past in order to correct it in the present and to build a different future. For Nietzsche, all three forms of history must be undertaken with moderation. The wrong place, the wrong time, the wrong amount of any of these pursuits of history would have toxic effects. Now, all three forms of history that Nietzsche praises as salutary are a part of practical life, the life of action, driven by present concerns and in light of the future. They are in no way parts of an objective or disinterested science. It is evident, moreover, that he sees the value of history as being political in some broad sense, belonging to a community or to a political community, that is, and in a special way. So monumental history, for instance, the exaltation of figures of the past, the telling of great stories of the past and great virtues, matters for the formation, the building of participants and leaders in political life by shaping their aspirations and inflaming their desire to imitate the virtues of their forebears. Antiquarian history is a mode of stewardship. An interest in one's ancestry, for instance, who are my ancestors, is a mode of commitment to one's family. An interest in antiquarian history is a mode of the commitment to the source of the customs of one's own community. I think about the cultivation of the lore of the college or the teachings of the college that some of us look to. I was once in the Lake District in England in a small town, and there was an annual custom that went back 1,000 years called rush bearing, where they would all bring rushes to the church and put them on the floor. And they were very interested in preserving this historically as a record of their ancient practice as a town. So they had these little historical pamphlets, rush bearing in Grasmere. Didn't explain anything. It was very interesting. So they knew it had always happened. They knew that they could think of some reasons why people would put rushes on the floor, but they couldn't figure out why there'd be an annual ceremony about it. So anyway, it's interesting that it's just an example of how this type of history is not necessarily about getting the grip on some kind of truth. It's more of a way of looking after the things that belong to one's habits and practices and customs. Critical history is a mode of improving one's political community, of liberating it from something from the past that strangles its growth or its flourishing. Why would history be limited in this way, in this very restricted way that Nietzsche describes as something which is useful for a political community in these particular ways? Limited to the practical, to the community, and subordinate to what Nietzsche calls life. The use of, what he means by that is hard, but let's say it's something like the use of the active and creative powers of the mind and the heart. So why would history be limited this way? And I think the truth is that history is already necessarily limited. This is one of the ways in which the predominance of historical fact and the constant appeal to historical fact can obscure things about the kind of knowledge that it is. Consider for a moment everything that's ever happened. It's by no means all historical. What I ate for breakfast this morning, or ate a year ago, or 20 years ago is not historical. It's simply a past happening. When we tell a history, we make a selection. Even if we choose to write a history of breakfast, or more narrowly, a history of breakfast in the United States, my own breakfast might fail to be of historical interest. As hurtful as that would be. The act of selection is made in the present when the history is told. Although, of course, the selections of the past will also have determined, for instance, which books of the past have survived in the present. So we live in a world that's in some way shaped by the selections that others have made. Jacob Klein, in his essay on history and the liberal arts, which I recommend, makes this point about the necessary selectivity of history, and another point that seems to me related. Klein observes that potentially there's a history of absolutely anything. We could tell a history of Friday night lectures, history of podiums, history of microphones, history of watches, history of audiences, history of public lectures, history of receptions in between lectures and question period, which is coming, it's coming. I find this breadth of scope of history mysterious, the fact that there can be a history of anything. There's not a geology of everything in principle, nor is there a science of nutrition for anything you can think of. For what kinds of inquiry is this true, that it in principle can apply to anything? I think there's certainly a philosophy of anything, in principle. Poetry. And I suspect there's also, at least worth considering very seriously, a mathematics of everything, or a physics or chemistry of everything. Does every form of inquiry that rests on this universal form that can be applied indifferently to anything also rely on a principle of selection, like history does? I'm not sure about this, but it seems to me not necessarily. Suppose there are universal and necessary laws of nature. I doubt there are, but suppose there are. The universality of their related sciences, physics, say, or chemistry, might just consist in the application of laws to an indefinite variety of particular situations. Likewise, in philosophy, the disciplines within it are often thought to have a kind of internal ordering. Logic as a foundation for the study of nature for ethics. That's one familiar version. There are others. Does history have laws, the way that physics has laws? It's my impression that laws of this kind have been sought, especially over the past 200 years. I'm skeptical that they can have been found. What seems to me more to emerge from the study of history is matters of common experience, formed by careful reflection on sets of events. Now, some of my colleagues thought I was going to say nothing good about history, so here it is. Here's the good part. Such a science of history, the kind I think that's practiced by Thucydides or Herodotus or Tocqueville or Tacitus or many other historians that we don't read, is not so much a science as a repository of wisdom, truths as general as oak trees come from acorns, where the sun rises each day in the east. Thucydides says, for instance, and he says many things like this, war is a violent teacher. He's always making these gnomic statements about what's true in general, always or for the most part, about human beings and their communities. Perhaps wealth provides for a leisure class, as Aristotle suggests in the opening of the Metaphysics, or too much wealth provides for decadence and decline, as perhaps Thucydides suggests. The things that come closest to an attempted science of history in our curriculum are Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations and the Marx readings that the seniors begin shortly. In my current state of ignorance, I suspect that these two authors also, whose works are packed with insights, have in the end produced only rules of thumb to guide large-scale practical judgment, and that their laws are not universal. Now, you will see at this part of the lecture I've become very hand-wavy and lazy and general. So let me try to make one more suggestion before we close as to why history might be necessarily, as I've been moving towards in my own way, a practical endeavor rather than a theoretical one, a way of doing things more than a way of understanding the way things work, or the way things are in a more general way. Aristotle famously claims in the last passage in the handout that poetry is more philosophical than history, since it aims at the universal. If I'm right in my instinct that there are no real laws of history, so that no science of history could explain every particular, so that the promise of history as this endless resource of explanations would prove to be a kind of red herring, a false flag, a source of illusion or delusion about where knowledge comes from. If there are no laws of history so that no science of history could explain every particular, as in the ambition of natural science, history can only collect and assemble particulars. It can only do so for a particular purpose, lest it be overwhelmed by a trillion trivialities, like what Ms. Hitz ate for breakfast. It seems to me natural that this would be a practical endeavor, just as the multitude of facts we use in everyday life are most evident, most useful, most valuable, most treasured in practical endeavors. Recall that at the outset of the lecture, facts seem to have these two uses, the attainment of practical goods and the claim to authority. Part of the fruits of, I think, this Nietzsche essay, one rule of thumb that he might be pointing us to is that history is always for a reason, for a purpose in a political community. So we should always ask why or what are we aiming for in a particular historical inquiry. Okay. Where are we left? This is the end of the lecture. It's actually section 3, even though I said there were going to be only 2. I numbered differently than I thought. Okay. As 2 of my colleagues asked me yesterday, is history all bad or is it sometimes good? It seems to me that we have good reason to think, and this is what I've been circling around without quite articulating, we are subject to endemic forms of distraction, illusion, and enchantment of our minds. Not the enchantment that makes Cinderella a princess, but the enchantment that turns Odysseus' companions into swine. We have an inclination, sometimes irresistible, to seek historical answers and to rest with them as complete, to let our inquiry come to a stop. For example, the biographical pseudo-answers that we find in one thought or another, in the dialogues of Plato, in this type of scholarship I was describing. Our search for collections of irrelevant facts can overwhelm our attention and lay waste to the precious time in which we live our lives. I do not believe this search for indifferent collections of irrelevant facts can ever be fruitful in the absence of universal laws of history that could somehow promise to explain all the happenings that had ever happened and all the doings that had ever been done. I will confess, however, to have found history very useful in studying old books. To be so useful, it seems to me, it must help us to see what our friends, our companions, the books and the authors themselves saw, to add texture and nuance to what we see through their eyes. Even so, this too is a limited use. We seek to meet our books and our authors on the grounds of shared interest, the shared interest, love, and zeal for the fundamental questions that we have in common with our books and authors. Until our fundamental inquiries are done, until we achieve mutual understanding with all of the humans of the past with whom we speak in conversation, it seems merely optional to seek out these nuances that history can provide. For our attitude to the past is shaped by its own sort of selfish concern, the concern for how we ought to live and how we ought to stand the world around us in light of that concern.